When people think about modern armored warfare, they usually picture tanks. But on today's battlefield, tanks don't fight alone. They are supported, protected, and sometimes replaced by a very different kind of vehicle. The M2 Bradley. Developed during the Cold War, the Bradley was designed as an infantry fighting vehicle, a machine meant to carry soldiers into battle, support them with firepower, and survive alongside main battle tanks like the M1 Abrams. On paper, it was a support vehicle, but in practice, it became something far more complex. Heavily armed for its class, equipped with anti-tank missiles, a 25mm cannon, and advanced optics for its time, the Bradley blurred the line between transport and combat platform. And in real conflicts, it was forced to prove itself under fire against tanks, armored vehicles, and modern anti-armor threats. So what exactly is the M2 Bradley? A supporting vehicle in the shadow of tanks, or a fighting machine in its own right? The story of the M2 Bradley begins in the same strategic environment as the M1 Abrams, the tension and expectations of the Cold War. As discussed earlier in a previous video, the United States and its NATO allies were preparing for a large-scale, high-intensity war in Europe against the Soviet Union. This was not a limited conflict, but a scenario involving massive armored formations, mechanized infantry, artillery, and air power operating simultaneously across a fast-moving battlefield. In this environment, tanks alone were not enough. Experience, going back as far as World War II, had already shown that tanks operating without infantry support were highly vulnerable. Wehrmacht doctrine, in particular, demonstrated the importance of close coordination between armor and infantry through the concept of Panzer Grenadiers. Infantry protected tanks from close-range threats, secured terrain, and operated in areas where armored vehicles were less effective. However, by the Cold War, this idea needed to evolve. The experience of the Vietnam War played an important role in shaping this shift. During that conflict, the U.S. military widely used the M113, a vehicle that was reliable, mobile, and capable of transporting infantry through difficult terrain. In many cases, it performed well in its intended role. However, Vietnam also exposed its limitations. The M113 was designed primarily as a carrier, not a fighting vehicle. Its armament, usually a single machine gun, was sufficient for basic defense, but not for engaging fortified positions or armored threats. In practice, crews often tried to use it more aggressively than it was designed for, adding extra weapons and operating it closer to combat. This highlighted a gap between doctrine and reality. Infantry needed a vehicle that could not only transport them safely, but also actively support them in battle. At the same time, its relatively light armor made it vulnerable to mines, ambushes, and anti-tank weapons, especially in the kind of close-range, unpredictable engagements that defined the war. These lessons reinforced the idea that future mechanized infantry vehicles would need both stronger protection and significantly greater firepower. The subsequent evolution of war technologies reinforced this understanding. The battlefield was becoming faster, more lethal, and more technologically complex. Infantry could no longer simply ride in trucks or lightly armored carriers and dismount near the front. They needed protection against artillery, small arms, and nuclear or chemical threats, while also maintaining the mobility to keep up with tanks like the M1 Abrams. Earlier vehicles, such as armored personnel carriers, were designed primarily for transport. They could deliver infantry to the battlefield, but once combat began, their role was limited. They lacked sufficient firepower and protection to actively participate in the fight. This created a gap between tanks and infantry, a gap that could be exploited by enemy forces. The solution was a new type of vehicle, not just a carrier, but a fighting platform. The vehicle, which in future became M2 Bradley, was needed to transport infantry safely, keep pace with main battle tanks, and at the same time provide significant firepower of its own. Unlike earlier carriers, it was expected to engage enemy forces directly, including armored vehicles, using onboard weapons such as autocannons and anti-tank guided missiles. This represented a major shift in concept, but at the same time, it was a problem. The development of the M2 Bradley was far from straightforward. In fact, it became one of the most controversial and debated armored vehicle programs of the Cold War. What began as a clear requirement, vehicle that could transport infantry and fight alongside tanks, quickly turned into a complex struggle between competing priorities, institutional interests, and changing expectations. At the core of the problem was a fundamental contradiction. The Bradley was expected to do everything at once. It needed to be mobile enough to keep up with fast-moving formations, heavily armed to engage enemy vehicles, well protected against modern threats, and at the same time capable of carrying a full squad of infantry. Each of these requirements pushed the design in a different direction. More armor meant more weight, which reduced mobility. More weapons required additional space and systems, which reduced troop capacity. Increasing capacity made the vehicle larger, which made it more visible and potentially more vulnerable. There was no perfect solution, only trade-offs. These trade-offs became the center of intense debates within the US military and defense establishment. Different groups emphasized different priorities. Some argued that firepower was essential, especially given the presence of Soviet IFVs like the BMP-1, which were already armed with cannons and anti-tank missiles. Others insisted that the primary role should remain infantry transport, warning that turning the vehicle into a light tank would compromise its core purpose. At the same time, issues of funding, procurement, and industrial interests added another layer of complexity. The program evolved over time, with changing specifications and repeated modifications, as different requirements were added or adjusted. This created delays, increased costs, and further controversy. The result was a vehicle that seemed to be constantly changing before it was even fully introduced. These internal conflicts later became widely known, partly due to the film The Pentagon Wars, which portrayed the Bradley program as an example of bureaucratic inefficiency and overcomplication. While the film exaggerates and simplifies many aspects for dramatic effect, it does reflect a real underlying issue: the difficulty of designing a single vehicle to fulfill multiple, sometimes conflicting roles. In the end, the M2 Bradley emerged as a compromise. It did not perfectly satisfy every requirement, but it combined mobility, firepower, protection, and troop transport into a single platform more effectively than previous vehicles. And it worked. The first large-scale combat use of the M2 Bradley came during the Gulf War, and it immediately demonstrated both the strengths of the vehicle and the logic behind its design. Like the M1 Abrams, the Bradley did not operate alone. It was part of a highly coordinated system of modern warfare, where reconnaissance, air power, artillery, and ground forces were tightly integrated. Within this system, the Bradley proved extremely effective. Its combination of a rapid-fire autocannon and anti-tank guided missiles allowed it to engage a wide range of targets. In fact, during the conflict, Bradleys destroyed a significant number of Iraqi armored vehicles, including tanks such as the T-72. In some cases, they were even credited with destroying more enemy armored vehicles than the Abrams itself, not because they were superior tanks, but because they were deployed in large numbers and had the ability to engage effectively at range using guided missiles. At the same time, its survivability proved to be relatively high. While not as heavily armored as a main battle tank, the Bradley's protection was sufficient for its role, especially when combined with the overall dominance of US forces in the air and on the ground. Most importantly, it allowed infantry to remain protected while moving across the battlefield and to fight either from within the vehicle or after dismounting. However, the Gulf War also revealed serious issues. One of the most notable was friendly fire. In the confusion of fast-moving operations, several Bradleys were mistakenly engaged by other US units, including Abrams tanks. This highlighted the difficulty of identification on a modern battlefield and the risks associated with highly lethal systems operating in close proximity. Despite these issues, the key takeaway was clear. The M2 Bradley worked exactly as intended within the system it was designed for. It supported tanks, transported infantry, and provided significant firepower, all while being integrated into a larger network of coordinated forces. But another important point also emerged. Even outside of this system, the Bradley proved to be a capable and flexible vehicle. Its firepower allowed it to operate effectively against a variety of targets, while its mobility and protection made it suitable for different types of missions. It was not just a supporting element, it was a true multi-role platform. In the years following the Gulf War, the Bradley continued to see extensive use, particularly during the Iraq War. In this conflict, much like the Abrams, it had to adapt to a different kind of warfare. Urban combat, insurgent tactics, and the widespread use of improvised explosive devices created new challenges. The Bradley's role shifted accordingly. It was used for patrols, urban operations, and direct fire support, often working closely with infantry in complex environments. Additional armor and modifications were introduced to improve protection against mines and ambushes, while tactics evolved to address the realities of asymmetric warfare. In more recent conflicts, including the Russo-Ukrainian War, the Bradley has once again been used in a high-intensity environment, this time against forces equipped with Soviet and Russian-designed vehicles. In this context, it has demonstrated its ability to engage armored targets effectively, using modern optics, missiles, and coordinated tactics. At the same time, the challenges of modern warfare, especially the widespread use of drones, precision weapons, and artillery, have affected the Bradley just as they have other armored vehicles. Survivability depends not only on the vehicle itself, but on how it is used within a broader system. This brings us back to the central idea. The M2 Bradley is an example of a vehicle that is both effective on its own and highly effective as part of a larger doctrine. In a well-coordinated system, it becomes a force multiplier, enhancing the capabilities of tanks, infantry, and other units. At the same time, its design gives it enough flexibility to remain useful even outside of ideal conditions. It is, in many ways, a product of the same philosophy as the M1 Abrams. Not just a machine, but part of a system. And when that system works, the results can be decisive.